Hello and welcome to week 3 of the Level 1 Health Ethics Workshop. This week we'll look at two classic ethical theories, deontology and consequentialism. These two theories look at determining the right course of action either by considering the duties and obligations and rules involved or by considering the consequences or outcomes of an action. Let's look at the first theory for this week, consequentialism. This moral theory was proposed by philosopher Jeremy Bentham and expanded by John Stuart Mill. They argued that the morally relevant factor in determining if something is right or wrong, moral or immoral, is the consequence of the decision. So if the situation turns out well, it was moral or right, and if it turns out badly, it was wrong. What's the bottom line? A good outcome is what determines if an action was right or wrong. The rest is irrelevant. One question that comes up with these kinds of judgments is what exactly constitutes a good outcome. One consequentialist theory that explains this is utilitarianism. Utilitarians explain good as a measure of the happiness in the world. So a good decision, a moral decision, will increase the total amount of happiness in the world, and a bad or immoral decision will decrease the happiness or increase the amount of sadness or pain in the world. Utility is the greatest good for the greatest number. It requires a calculation of harms versus benefits. One interesting thing about this theory is that no one person counts for any more than anyone else. It's impartial. Everyone is equal. And judgments of happiness need to be made impartially as well. The other thing to know about utilitarianism and consequentialist theories in general is that justice, or the right thing, is not absolute. A given choice may not always be right. Sometimes it might be right to tell a lie. For example, if it'll make people happy and not hurt anyone. Other times, lying would be judged to be wrong. For the utilitarian, everybody counts as one and nobody counts for more than one. One criticism of utilitarianism is that under this theory, it's okay to sacrifice one or a few to benefit the many. For example, during the 2011 flood, there was discussion of opening the dike to flood part of southern Manitoba in order to save many more people who were upstream. This sounds great if you live upstream, but if you were one of the 100 or so people whose homes might have been flooded downstream, it would certainly not feel very ethical. So there are some challenges with utilitarianism. The few who are sacrificed for the benefit of the many are certainly not going to like it. Is one very sad person equivalent to 5 indifferent or slightly happy people? 10? 100? And sometimes it's hard to predict what the outcomes might be. And even if there is a reasonable ability to predict, how far into the future do you need to look when you're calculating the net happiness or sadness? Is it an hour, a year, a generation? Clearly, consequentialism does not offer all the answers to questions of right and wrong. One answer to the problems of consequentialism is another moral theory called deontology. This is a theory explored by Immanuel Kant in the 18th century that emphasizes obligations and rules. Deontologists say moral decisions are governed by a duty to do the right thing. For the deontologist, intentions and motives are more important than consequences. The basic premise is to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. How do we know what the right thing is? Well, we get there through reason and actively thinking about how we should behave. Kant came up with a couple of important rules that can help us when we're thinking about how we should behave. He called the first and most important one the categorical imperative. That rule said that you should only do what it would be reasonable for everyone to do all the time. So if you can think of a reason that it would be bad for someone to do something, that thing will be wrong. One example he uses is lying. He argues that if everyone lied, we'd never know who was telling the truth, and we'd never be able to trust anyone. Therefore, he says, it's never right to lie. The second rule is never to treat people only as a means to an end. This is a direct response to the utilitarians who feel like it's okay to sacrifice one for many. The ones who are sacrificed are being used as a means to the happiness of the others. Kant said this is wrong and immoral because it fails to treat all people with respect. These rules are principles that can help us determine if something is right or wrong. The challenge with this theory is what happens when one duty outweighs another. The example that most people think of here is if a murderer came to the door and asked whether your spouse was home because he planned to kill them. The deontologist would say that because there's a binding universal duty to tell the truth, it would be wrong to lie when your spouse was home, even though their murder would undoubtedly bring sadness and pain. However, the utilitarian would point out that in this case, it's probably okay to lie, even if generally lying is not a good thing. The utilitarian might ask why the duty to protect someone from harm, which seems like an equally reasonable rule, isn't more important than the duty to tell the truth. When these things are incompatible, Kant's theory doesn't do much to help us sort out the priority. Enter William David Ross, who came up with a way to help. He suggested that duties are obligatory unless there are good reasons to override them. The duties he talked about are fidelity, reparation, gratitude, justice, beneficence, self-improvement, and non-maleficence. These can be shuffled and reordered depending on the circumstances. This answers some of the problems with deontological theory. In healthcare, as in everything in the real world, these two concepts are hard, if not impossible, to separate. Everything we do is governed or guided by law, professional codes of ethics, or corporate policies and procedures. Of course, there are also consequences for every action, and sometimes the consequences are a stronger consideration than the rule. To illustrate these theories now, we'll look at a case. Our activity for this week is to look at the case of Paul Mills. The case is laid out in your workbook. As you'll read, Paul Mills was a very sick man. In fact, he was dying in an ICU in Nova Scotia. His family had agreed that it was time to withdraw life support. Unfortunately, when they removed his ventilator, he did not die right away, but continued to gasp for air, suggesting he was suffering terribly. The family was upset, the staff were upset, and this was truly an awful situation. In the end, the attending physician, Dr. Nancy Morrison, injected Mr. Mills with potassium to stop his heart and end his suffering. We can argue about whether what Dr. Morrison did was right or wrong, and it would probably be a very interesting conversation. But what I want to talk about is why we think what we think. So to review, the deontologist determines right and wrong based on one's motives and intentions in the context of the rules, duties, and obligations they have that are guiding their actions. Good actions are motivated by the intention to fulfill their duties or obligations. The consequentialist judges the rightness and wrongness of actions by what happens after them. Good outcomes mean the action was right. Bad outcomes mean the action was wrong or unethical. In the comments this week, I want to focus on how we decide whether Dr. Morrison did the right thing or the wrong thing. That is, I don't want to spend too much time on whether she behaved ethically or unethically, but on how you reach that judgment. When you're thinking about your posting this week, think about these questions. What are some of the outcomes for Dr. Morrison? How about for Dr. Mills and his family? How do these consequences help you decide whether Dr. Morrison's action was right or wrong? What were Dr. Morrison's intentions? What were her duties when she was caring for Mr. Mills? How do these factors help you decide whether Dr. Morrison's action was right or wrong? The Paul Mills case is outlined in your workbook. Have a look at it, read the details, and then post your thoughts on these questions in the comments section. Next week we'll be talking about ethical principles, specifically autonomy, beneficence or doing good, non-maleficence or avoiding harm, and justice. For homework, please read section 3 in your workbook. I look forward to your discussions.